Welcome to the EnVibe Live Conversations podcast with Amy Parker and Cheryl Dunn. By tuning in, you are joining a community that will inspire you to increase balance, wellness, and joy in your life. We will offer expert information and insightful conversations to help us all on our journey to live more in vibe. For more information and articles, remember to also check out our website at envibelife.com. That's EnVibelife.com. We're grateful that you are here. Hello, welcome to EnVibe Live Conversations with Amy Parker and Cheryl Dunn. We're joined today by Sally Lombardo. Sally is someone I've met recently through friends who said, this is a woman you have to talk to. And as things happen for us sometimes, one of the topics that Cheryl and I have been talking about a lot lately is grief. Cheryl experienced a loss in her life recently. And I know that past losses have been big precipitating factors for spiritual growth for you in general. The whole country has experienced a loss of sorts and a changed lifestyle and things like that lately. So grief has been coming up for us a lot. And we've thought we really need to talk about some of these topics on the podcast. And then sure enough, we were led to meet Sally. And Sally Lombardo, thank you so much for joining us today. We have been so excited about this conversation since you and I first spoke, and I immediately called Cheryl and told us about our conversation. So thank you for carving out time and being here. We'd love for you to tell a little bit about yourself and your background for our audience.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to it as well. My background really begins before I went to seminary, which has been a big part of my journey. That when my 5 children were growing up and leaving the home, I thought, what do I want to do? And I'd taught a lot of Bible study. I'd taught college English, and it just seemed like an appropriate next step for me. But I suppose my interest in this really came from my teaching in college and then mentoring a lot of young women. And I also am a doula, and I taught childbirth classes for a long time. And what I began to learn during that was that people are suffering all the time in different ways and not sharing that or hiding it or sort of expressing it inappropriately, dealing with things alone, feeling like they are alone, feeling like this is something that's never happened to anyone but them. And somehow I began to feel compassion for this. And then as I worked with my childbirth moms and would go into the hospital or be at home births, and I assisted midwives for a while, I began to see that you could build a relationship with suffering. And I know that sounds odd, but I encouraged girls in childbirth all the time to not run from that, not to run from the pain and not to even close it off, but to sort of stay with it and push through different things. And that precipitated just my getting to know those girls on a real close basis and their families and sort of see what else might be they be bringing into the birth. And so I started to see that suffering is multi-layered, but that it can be addressed. And then I experienced about 4 years ago, a member of my family died. And this was a very difficult death because she decided to be very isolated in her death. And I was in the middle of an MDiv at seminary, and I was anxious to help, and I was powerless. I couldn't get into that, and I couldn't help her reconcile some family relationships. And I watched this all playing out in a way that was ultimately destructive in many ways to our whole family. And I found it just sad. I wasn't angry. I wasn't necessarily disappointed, but I thought, how can we help people with suffering and even in the dying process and not just jump in afterwards and help with grief? So I began to be interested in it. And then I've taken it on as a doctoral project of writing about suffering with hope. So that's sort of my story.
You also work as a chaplain.
Right.
So you are around it and helping people cope with it daily.
Right. And that's our whole challenge, is how do we walk with people in their suffering without trying to fix it, without trying to come in with solutions, answers, do this. If you do this, you'll feel better. You'll feel well. So as a chaplain, you can't help people feel better a lot of the time. That's not really my job. And so I'm there to walk beside them and give them some kind of hope, which the only hope may be that I'm standing there listening and trying to validate them. And that may be something that is all I can offer at that moment. And it's beautiful when people want to close with prayer. And that's a big part of what we do as well.
So I think something we hear a lot, I'm going to call this a basic question, but I'm not sure it's really a basic question, is like, why do we have suffering? Like you hear that all the time. If, you believe in God and God is a loving God, why would he make people suffer? How do you answer that question for people?
Right. I had a lady ask me the other day, right when I walked in her room, she said, why is this happening to me?
Yeah.
I mean, she was actually a young woman. And so that question comes up a lot. And what you learn from theology or reading and then own experience is just that the world was set in motion, and the world is a place of brokenness and pain. And there's no way around that. I recently read a book by Gene Stairs called Listening for the Soul. And it's really about the rhythm of death and resurrection in all of life. And it's so beautiful because it really reminds us that there's this natural ebb and flow in the world. And we see it all the time in the natural world. We see it in animal life and plant life and the sun rising and setting. We see death, and then we see resurrection and restoration over and over again. And I think that we do well just to give over to that type of natural rhythm of life. And if it weren't there, life wouldn't be real at all. We would be some sort of prescribed puppets in some show where nothing ever went wrong. And we think we want it that way, but that's not real. It's not real life. So we journey through suffering, which is just a part of even plants. If you look at plants, like after our freeze last year, I was walking around a lot, just looking like the plants had suffered. They were all just dilapidated. And that's just a part of the creation.
It always reminds me of the saying that the light comes through the cracks.
Yes, right. If not, you don't appreciate the light.
Right, exactly. It's interesting. Amy was explaining how I dealt with my own personal grief that I really feel like kind of was the process that brought us into starting EnVibe, dealing with the loss of my brother. And that's been about, I guess, 5 or 6 years now. Recently, my father-in-law passed away, and it was and I was very close to him, but it was a completely different process because I felt like when my brother passed, I couldn't see outside of my own grief. Like it was just my own grief and suffering was so encompassing. I could only think about myself. Mm-hmm. Well, my mother-in-law came and stayed with me after my father-in-law passed. And so I felt like I was on the outside helping her process all of it. And that was really hard. Even though I feel like Amy and I talk about this stuff a lot, I just pulling up any tools or being able to support her was super challenging. Mm-hmm. Do people talk about that when maybe you're supposed to be the supportive role, and that's a hard role to have?
You mean when it has also happened to you, but you can't grieve your own loss? You're trying to help.
Yeah, I think that's a hard place to be too. It was hard to grieve your own loss when you, in your mind, feel like I'm supposed to be helping them.
Mm-hmm. Well, in a minute, when we'll talk about sort of these different kinds of loss, grief is necessarily a self-oriented process. So, and unless you can make peace with that and allow that, you'll never quite feel like it was resolved, because you can't really grieve for someone else who's grieving. We have to do it on our own. So I think what you were feeling was legitimate. because you needed to go through your own process as well. And we can be there for other people. Like sometimes I feel, I was in a room the other day of parents who were having to make a tough decision about taking their son off life support after a suicide attempt. So it was very dark and difficult. And I finally left the room and I just stopped in the hall and I just wanted to wail. And I thought, I can't do that because all these running around nurses, other people would look at me like, what's the matter? Well, you're not supposed to do this. So I allowed myself that experience though, because it was almost too close to home because I have 4 sons. Yeah. And so I had to say, it's okay to feel this. And I need to feel something. And I sometimes leave the hospital and walk across the street to Herman Park in Houston and just sit. And so we have to acknowledge that you can't just fully be there for someone else. That's God's role.
Yeah.
You know.
Mm-hmm. Grief can look a lot of different ways too. People really react to a loss. And I know we haven't gotten to talking about loss yet, but in really different ways that can almost be confusing, or to recognize, oh, this might seem odd to me or like an affront, but it's their way of pushing their grief aside.
Right. And I did think hard about when you asked me, does all grief look the same? And it can manifest in many different ways. So some people will hold it in because they think they should, like you might see a widow, an older widow, sort of acting like everything's okay when her husband died because they've lived together for 50 years or 50 plus and it was all good. And so they keep up a good face, but it will come out in different ways. And when you get practiced at looking for that, you can tell. So it might come out in anger. It sometimes comes out in inappropriate ways where they are not responsible to other people, or they release things in different ways, or they'll begin to develop bizarre habits. So grief will find its way out. You know, it's like a person almost. It will make sure it's heard. And some people will get very self-oriented, or some people will choose to serve others. But if you don't allow it, it will never really resolve. But given that, addressing what you're saying, grief never completely or wholly ends. You usually carry grief most of the rest of your life because that's how humans are. We're wired to love one another and we're wired to grieve the loss of someone. But we need to allow ourselves to make peace with that. And then just that it never completely ends. But the more that you allow it to process, I think the better people are.
Well, and I think like when you were talking about that, I was thinking about our own personal grief from maybe a trauma or a suffering that occurred to us when we were little. Like, you hear a lot of people that maybe had a traumatic instance in childhood or adolescence or young adulthood and maybe didn't properly address it, that then 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, it'll pop up, maybe even in a physical manifestation, or in why can't I have the relationship I want? Or why, are these other things not falling into place in my life?
Absolutely. And I think we all experience loss. In fact, John Claypool, who was an Episcopal priest who wrote about the death of his daughter in a beautiful little book, but he talks about the first time he experienced his loss was his puppy dying when he was 4, that he accidentally slammed the back door on without realizing. So he said it affected the rest of his life. And it really, if we all experience that, so it's nothing, we can't escape from it. And I think that you're right, that we can see it reemerge, and that's okay. The point is not to be afraid of that. I had a girl in my childbirth teaching days that was having a hard time getting pregnant. And we kind of explored together. I mean, she really didn't have a physical reason. So we just explored together why she was afraid of it. And she eventually did, but it was a trauma in childhood. Something had happened to one of her younger siblings when that sibling was 2 or something. And so she was holding on to that. Our bodies never lie. Our bodies, as you know, so much. They hold things. So I think that's something that we can explore without fear.
One thing I see often is within 6 months, sometimes sooner, sometimes a little after, that someone has gone through the trauma of losing somebody close, their body has a major physical reaction, whether it's something, like a disc being thrown or cancer coming, or, it's quickly that things will happen that are pretty big health concerns.
Yes.
Somebody, I see that correlation all the time.
Right. And you see it because you believe it, because it's there. So when your eye gets attuned to that and you allow it in as a truth, you'll see it all the time, this connection between people becoming ill in different ways from what we might also know is just the randomness of life, and that it's not anything that they carried, but we do see that. You're sort of getting into the subject, Amy, of what do we learn from suffering? You want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I do. Is there hope, or how do we find hope?
Is there hope?
Yeah.
Kind of like we could say that about a lot of things, but there is hope. There's hope all the time in every minute of life, really. Like just the fact that we met, all of us, is so beautiful. So, and alleviates any kind of suffering of feelings of loneliness, even in this whole time. But you had asked me kind of what's at the other end. And so I think about that all the time, because that is a question that people often ask in the hospital. And then girls I teach in Bible study, just, will this ever end? And what can I expect? So it's largely up to us. That's what's so interesting, what lies at the other end, because it's largely how we see it. And even though this does not go against what the Bible teaches us either, because like I just wrote this book on Job and Ruth and Hannah and their suffering that they experienced, which was all different, but it was how they prayed honestly back to God through it all. They never hid that. They just became vulnerable. So every time there's some kind of suffering in the form of illness or estrangement from someone you love, these are all bad sufferings we go through. Loss of a relationship, painful partings, painful, endings of things, loss of a dream, and even death. We have this opportunity to learn, from it, not just say, what can I learn stoically, but more to walk into the light that might be at the other, side of that. So with Job, Ruth, and Hannah, they each lost different things. Job lost sort of everything material that he had and all his family members. Ruth lost her whole past history, her country, and the memory of, she completely traded all that for something new. And Hannah was faced with giving up a dream. And she ended up having a beautiful answer to that prayer, but it was not the answer she might have wanted. It was not, I prayed for a child and he came, and wasn't that wonderful? She gives that boy back to the temple, which she promised God. So it was not, there was a cost, in her letting go. So some of life, I think, is honestly just enduring things and reframing them as best you can. Like, well, even Cheryl, your loss and with your mother-in-law, it was, right?
Passed, and my mother-in-law moved in after that.
And it was an opportunity to practice kind of learning, how do I relate to someone that I wouldn't normally relate to? And I believe so many things are brought by God in front of us he stretches us constantly with, now you're going to learn this, because we don't know what's ahead, but the Lord does. So we get to experience things that are part of our training. But we just in these three characters, Job learned to endure because he relied on his former faith that he had built already. He didn't just look up one day and go, wow, I need to figure something out here. I don't know how to have faith through loss. He had practiced that, which I think is a lesson for us. Ruth really endured because she kept choosing hope. She chose it. She chose Naomi. She chose this new life. She chose to go ahead and work in the field. as a lowly worker because she knew it would open doors for her. So it involves our conscious choice. You know, we don't just sit there and hope things get better. We take initiative. This morning, I just taught the story of the Canaanite woman to a group of people who persisted in her asking Jesus to come to her. So we have a role, in our overcoming. And I think that that's what's at the other end, is what we hope and want to be at the other end.
Oh gosh, absolutely. Yeah,
really
we can help affect it. And we even had a podcast early on that I think we called Choose Joy. And it's been a topic that's come up for us over and over again, even with some guests, that you can really behave happiness, or you can choose happiness, choose joy, choose fun. I never thought about choosing hope, but you can also choose hope is one of the messages you're giving here.
I know. And that puts a lot of responsibility on us. And we don't like that sometimes. We think, I just want things to happen to me. But really, it's so many things are our decisions. And even I've had a few broken friend relationships in life that I didn't choose to break. But I grieved those so much until I felt one day, well, reconcile with someone else then. Reconcile with someone who wants to. And that's choosing hope. That you hope you can have a relationship restored. Maybe I can't have that one, but I can have another one, or build a new relationship or something. So that's how we can be part of our own healing, really.
I love it, because it's kind of like, by us having a responsibility or actions that need to be taken, that goes with, there's no magic pill, right? There's no magic pill there in anything in life. There's not that magic pill. It really takes effort. And I often tell Amy this, and the people that are listening to the podcast are like, oh, we've heard this. But I have one child that he thinks he can drop out of school. He doesn't really need school. They're not teaching me anything. I can keep going.
And he's like 11, right?
Okay. Yeah. And he thought drop out yet. The second day of kindergarten, he told me he wasn't going back because he didn't learn how to read the first day. So this has been an ongoing conversation for the last 8 years now. But almost every morning I drop him off, I'm like, you got to look for the things that make you happy there. You get to see your friends. You can choose to look at the homework, and that's going to make you, or you can choose to look at the fun times you have. You have a choice throughout your day, because you're going to continue to go.
Yeah, right. You are.
You're not a YouTuber yet.
Yes.
So yeah.
No. And the hope in that I hear you saying is that this is a very, very bright young man. And so the hope is that maybe he will start a type of education someday for students like him who need more, need faster, need to accomplish more. So the hope is that you're seeing this glimpse of a person who's talking about what his future is going to be. And that's what's so beautiful, I think, about it.
Oh, well, he would die if he heard that. He'd be like, what? Create a school?
Yeah. Cheryl's often said, I can talk about my children on the podcast because they don't listen anyway. So, but I do want to get into that thought of, you have alluded to during this conversation. And I know that in the conversation you and I had leading up to the podcast, that there are many different kinds of loss. And I think that's one of the things that I carried away from our initial conversation, more than anything else, because I hadn't really thought about it like that before, that, loss of a dream, loss of a goal, as well as loss of a loved one or loss of a job, or those things we normally think about. Will you talk about that a little bit, like how many different sorts of loss we experience and then how that impacts us?
Right. That is so important. And I really had not appreciated that until I did this chaplaincy residency and learned about that, because that you can identify with so many of them. And the 6 types, which I'll just list because it's really important to understand, that are material loss, which is obvious. And I have a friend who was in those fires in Colorado, came back and her house is burned down. And so that's one huge type. Then there's relationship loss, which we can all fill in the blanks on that. Intrapsychic loss is losing sort of this an emotionally important image of yourself. Often this happens to children. Either if there's a divorce maybe in the family, or someone dies unexpectedly, or something they move or something happens, there's this deep internal sense of, I don't look the same anymore to me. And that's a loss, that we have to really understand. Then there's functional loss, which is huge, which is an illness or neurological loss or physical type of muscular function. And that is something I deal with a lot. I work at a rehab hospital. So most of these people are dealing with that. With now I'm in a wheelchair. What is my new normal? And that is, we navigate that, with them. Then there's systemic loss, which is really important too, which is like a whole system changes. And that's happened in our pandemic when people aren't working in offices anymore. Most people are at home. You've sort of got to navigate. Now what? I never see my coworkers or friends, and that's all changed. And then we'll talk in a minute, I'm sure, about sort of the overall societal systemic loss that we've experienced. So it's really important to acknowledge part of one of these is what they call ambiguous loss. When a person in your family changes or is ill, or, Cheryl, you've experienced this with, it's when the person is there, but they're not the same anymore. Or that can be even when a person just sort of is more removed from a relationship, but is maybe there in person, but they're not there. So you're experiencing this great sense of loss of what's happened to my identity and our world together. So these can be permanent or temporary. They can be avoidable or not, and they can be unpredictable. And there's sort of this theory that we learn in chaplaincy that life is a series of attachments and losses. And the more you kind of become okay with that, you become more willing to let go. It was a loss, but I'm going to form another attachment. I'm going to form another one. But it's biblical, really. What we see are these couples forming attachments. One person dies, they form another attachment. They move, they go places. And so it's just the way life is. But it's once you even for friendships, if you just understand that about another person, it gives you a lot of empathy for maybe a type of loss that person just went through that doesn't have to be death.
Well, and that's something I want to hit upon because it just came up. I've talked about this a lot lately because change really is a type of loss too, because you're moving from one thing to the other. It doesn't always have to be negative or bad necessarily to still have a loss that you're having to adjust to or grieve about. I think we think about loss as being that loved one passed away or a job loss. And so, well, then you're justified in being sad, or then you're justified in needing some emotional support or help. I know, and I've shared this, and every one of our podcast listeners has learned of this, that my husband and I went through a lot of change last year in 2021. And that we sold a business. And that's a good thing, right? Yay, let's celebrate, let's rejoice. But for me, I've had a lot of trouble just dealing with, okay, now my life looks differently than I really thought it was going to look like right now. Mm-hmm. And we've got a long process with this particular example, but, to transition out of that. But then what's going to be there on the other end for us? And while that's really scary, and it's not what I expected at this age. And then I've had to deal a lot with the fact that I feel guilty for saying that's been difficult for me in any way, because it's this great thing. But I've also had to deal with the loss of the life I had in order to start welcoming in, okay, well, now what comes next? Mm-hmm. And it's really surprised me that I've had to deal with it the way I have.
Right. Well, that's what this is helpful in, is giving you a sense of compassion for your own self. Mm-hmm. Because until we have compassion on ourselves, it's really hard to offer it to other people.
It's impossible. Yeah.
And that's a truth you learn as you get older. And I remember thinking with my own children, I was hard on them because I was so hard on myself. And the day I learned that, I thought, this has to end because it's not fair. But it's if you allow yourself, like Andy Stanley, who, his father's Charles Stanley in Atlanta, talks a lot about giving yourself margins. in life. And so one margin would be when you leave a type of system that you were in, and where there were a lot of rewards and there was, cost and gain and lifestyle, is allowing yourself to grieve that, giving yourself a space and time, which I tell people all the time may mean a 6-month series of evening walks where you just process that together. You live in
be gentle with myself. And then I've also had to, affirm to myself, if I weren't having any parts that I were sad to leave behind, then what had I really created?
Yeah.
It's because there were great parts and beautiful parts. And those are the things that it's kind of sad to leave on the one hand. And then the other thing is just sort of fear of the unknown. What is on the other side of this? Where does it go? And that's just scary. Even if it's great, it still can be scary. And that's, but that's what you talked about, the renewal and rebirth. And I think a lot of times we say, people say like, I want a new job, or I want a new partner. I want, when they're looking for that change in life. And then you have to recognize that even when you get that change is going to mean something else is going away in order to make room for the new. Right.
It's the rhythm of what I learned in that book, the death and then a resurrection of something new and restoration. But it's not that's right. We're so glib about all the things we do. Like, I'm going to leave this. And yet we don't realize some of the cost.
I think it's hard sometimes too, because you're talking about the death and the resurrection is when you're going through the death process, it's sometimes hard to see the resurrection.
So hard.
That's the hard part, is when you're in the depths of it, to see that there's going to be something I'm going to learn from this. There's going to be some silver lining. There's, that's, I think, a hard thing to.
That's like holding on to a string. It's like holding on. But this author, Ken Matthews, that wrote this book, All Our Losses, All Our Griefs, talks a lot about the grief that is buried that will turn into guilt, often for different reasons, and then shame. So once you get to that point, you've really dug yourself down, and it is very hard to see out. So again, it's just this important process of allowing grief, allowing it, and saying almost like, excuse me, I have to go deal with my own grief for a while and not keep avoiding it. And so you find ways that you need to do that. And then it keeps it from turning into shame. Or because we do all feel this bizarre, and he describes it as the shame becomes a monster. And I think the monster can keep us from recovering. So that's the point we try to help others not get to, and we try to prevent in ourselves.
And I think all of us carry on some level, and all about different things, a little bit of guilt and a little bit of shame in our lives. We carry that. And I think the hard part might be sometimes is to recognize where that is showing up, where we're having that conversation in our head that's coming from a place of shame or guilt, and then releasing that in order to not carry it anymore.
Mm-hmm. In order to not inflict others with our own sense of, which is what we do, and that's where it began to hit me. As I looked at how maybe I was treating those people closest to me. And I thought, I'm carrying something that's driving this. So that's why it's important to let it turn into a true sense of humility rather than some kind of false humility that masks as shame.
I love it. I feel like there's society-wise, that's something that has been sparked or brought up is that guilt and shame that I feel like we see it a lot more now with COVID, like shaming other people, feeling guilt. You should feel guilty for this. I feel like that's coming on, or has been coming on, with all of the conversation around everything with COVID.
But don't you think and I'm jumping in here, I feel like one of the biggest things though is the community sense of grief, because sort of that situation I described, that we all had to change our lives so drastically. And so, like when you say, Sally, that when you're not acknowledging or processing that grief, it's going to come out in other ways. This is what you're describing, one way that it can come out.
So you mean you feel like during COVID, people have made other people feel guilty about things like going around people, or if you give it.
Yes.
Oh.
Maybe
Yes.
wearing a mask.
Right.
We're not wearing a mask, getting vaccinated, not getting
All those
vaccinated.
topics.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think that's coming from the incredible amount of fear that everyone's feeling of the unknown. So that's that displaced grief.
Mm-hmm.
And really, you and I, Amy, had talked a little bit about the collective grief in the world right now. And it's the first time, we've experienced that in our generation here, because we didn't go through World War II when they were experiencing pretty much globally this collective scream going up of, we can't keep doing this. And now all we have to do is read about World War II to realize what they went through. So now here it is, it's on us. And I do think that what people are experiencing is this unsettled fear of the unknown, because we don't really have a lot of straight answers. I don't think we're suffering from isolation as much, because now we have ways we can get with people, and we've been with our families, and we develop new, like little hobbies, or we exercise more. I mean, we've kind of been filling the time, but everybody's afraid. And I think that this is so biblical, because if you really read Romans 8, that's where Paul talks about the creation groaning. And this is the first, I've been mentioning this a lot to people that I teach, because this is the first time we really know what he's talking about. The creation is totally groaning now with words that can't be expressed, that we're suffering with what we don't know if is here to stay, is going to morph again. And so blaming each other really is just probably what happens in all kinds of different pain situations. But I think we know a lot as a society now about curative things for this, and people like Richard Rohr, or people like that have podcasts and are trying to address some of this. We're not just out here on our own floundering around. So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So
that is a good thing.
So before we wrap up, is there any final thought you'd like to leave with everyone on topics of loss and suffering, grief, joy, resurrection?
Yeah. Only that we have a lot of good examples for all of this all through time, whether it's in literature. There are so many biblical examples of people that walked through suffering and made it to the other side, and that we have to utilize what we know and what we have. We have to reach out and go into another gear. We have to reach for that other gear and read about these people, see what they did, see how they handled it, take hope in that, and with hope, have courage.
I love that.
That is a great message to end on. I feel so strongly just that someone out there, at least someone out there, needed to hear this today. And so thank you, Sally, for being with us and sharing your insights with us. It was really beautiful.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Well, thank y'all so much too. And I just thought of this. I wrote a book about the women who founded the early church. It's called 7 Brave Women. And they suffered a great deal. And this was my whole theme in that, was that these women carried the early church. They carried the initial church that met in the homes. Without these women, I don't know if it would have endured. So they were very brave. And that's a theme for me really in life.
Oh, I love it.
I forgot. I should have mentioned that, because that little book has been a part of my growth. But thank you all so much.
Yes. And thank you for joining us. And, you can find more of the information in our show notes. So do that. Share this podcast with someone maybe who you think it might help or might benefit from hearing it. So thank you, Sally. We hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining our conversation today. For more information or to learn more about EnVibe Life, we hope you'll visit us at www.envibelife.com. You can find links and show notes for this episode on our podcast page.
Please like, follow, and leave a review for our podcast. We hope that you will listen again soon.